Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I have the pleasure to share with you some very interesting quick games. Generally, I don't recommend my students to spend much time on opening preparation. I really don't believe knowing specific opening lines are very important until you reach generally around 1800 or 2000 level. That's when you would start kind of building things a little bit. However, there are some opening traps that's worthwhile knowing how to avoid. And I'd like to draw your attention to a few of those in this lesson. The first game we're going to see is being played on the black side by the former world champion Anatoly Karpov, back from his younger days in 1968. Well, let's get to that game. As I said, he had the black pieces, and his opponent with white started out the game by playing d4. He responded knight f6, his favorite choice, and the opponent continued with knight f3. Again, a very common move, in addition to the more principal continuation, which would be playing c4 instead. In these early stages of the game, of course, there are many good ways to go. One would be for black right now to play d5, or another could be playing g6, just to mention a few. But Karpov's move, of course, is also one of the main moves, which is playing e6. This determines that the bishop wants to develop on the a3, f8 diagonal. And at this position, white most often would play c4, giving black the option to either play the Queen's Indian defense or the Queen's Gambit. However, in this game, white played differently, trying to avoid the main theoretical lines. In chess, one of the challenges is you can either choose to play popular lines or rather avoid those popular routes that most people play and play kind of sidelines. And my recommendation is that as a developing player, generally it's better not to waste too much time and energy in learning opening lines. Because at the end of the day, it may not even give you a better position out of the opening, and even if it does, it still doesn't get you much closer to winning the game. Ultimately, the games are getting decided in the middle game. And the middle game consists of two major parts, tactics and strategy. So therefore, I would call the meat of chess is the middle game. And therefore, I recommend all non-professional players to focus on understanding the game better, as well as perfecting their calculation skills. Now, none of those have much to do with openings. Although, even in openings, sometimes calculation may be necessary. However, generally, you can just follow the basic principles and use common sense, such as to develop your pieces or castle timely and focus on the center. In this game, white chose a well-playable sideline, avoiding the main ambitious lines by playing c4, and white played bishop to g5. What's the idea? Idea is simple. It's pinning the knight, it is developing the bishop, and at the same go, because white has created a pin over black's knight on f6, white is trying to get to play e4, despite that the knight seems to be guarding that square for the moment. Black has various ways to react to that. Either play d5 with his own pawn from d7 to prevent e4. Another typical response would be to ask the bishop, where do you want to go? Either go back, trade, or if you want to maintain the pin, then the bishop goes to h4. However, in that case, that h7, h6 move would have achieved some positive for black. On one hand, that black, after castling kingside, no longer would need to worry about the back rank trouble. And two, the bishop is limited to only one diagonal instead of being in control of both. meaning that the bishop no longer controls squares on the c1 h6 diagonal. However, let's go back to the game where black instead continued by playing c5. Now this is a very typical and good move in this position because black immediately challenges white in the center. Now white has two choices, either to ignore the situation considering the fact that the pawn is already protected by several white pieces, or white could trade himself on c5. That would be illogical though. If white right now would trade on c5, it would invite for black to develop in a natural way in one move. Typically in situations like this, you would want to wait until this bishop moves and then possibly to do that trade, so the bishop will need to lose two moves in order to get to that same c5 square. But before we go further, I would like to point out that if white would have taken on c5, all of a sudden white would have to be careful not to fall in some traps. Like for example, right here, if white would want to play g3 to then develop the bishop to g2, that would already be a major mistake. And this is a typical opening trap pattern that I'd like you to remember. And in particular, black could be immediately winning a pawn by capturing on f2, temporarily sacrificing the bishop, and when the king captures back, the knight would be ready to jump to e4, check, and forking all of a sudden the white bishop and the king. When the king moves out, the knight is ready to capture the bishop. Of course, the knight now is protected by the queen, and therefore black simply won a pawn and achieved a superior position. So going back to the position of the game after black played c5 on the third move, white continued by playing c3. A bit better would have been to play e3 to open up the diagonal of the other bishop and give further support to that pawn on d4. If now black captures on d4, the white pawn would capture back. Generally, it's best to have a pawn in the center, especially at such an early stage of the game. But, as I said, the game continued with white playing c3, with the idea also that after black would take, as Karpov did, a pawn could capture back. However, in this particular situation, we need to be aware of the fact that while the bishop on g5 certainly does something in pinning the knight, it left the knight on b1. And this is one of those examples that demonstrates why the famous saying makes sense, that develop knights before bishops. Because in this case what happened is, white left kind of unguarded the pawn on b2. And it invited black to immediately try to take advantage of that situation by playing queen b6. Would the white bishop be still back on c1? Of course, this move would make no sense. Right now, after the black queen moved to b6, the pawn is hanging, so white has to try to look for a way to protect it. If white, in the meantime, would want to make an intermediate move and capture on f6, ruining black's pawn structure, then black wouldn't be forced to right away capture the bishop, but could make an important intermediate move by capturing on b2, attacking the rook in the corner, while white will be busy in saving the rook by moving the knight out to d2. So now the white queen from d1 protects the rook, then black will be ready to capture back. So therefore, that intermediate move of white's capturing on f6 and then trying to protect the pawn doesn't quite work. White continued right now by moving the queen to b3. Other options, of course, were also possible, even a move like bishop to c1. However, that would be considered a waste of time, and white should do something like that only if that's the last resort to avoid material loss. Moving the queen to d2 has its own problems. First of all, black would have the opportunity to play a move like bishop b4, and then followed by knight e4. Okay, so white, instead of queen d2, played queen b3 in the game, offering the exchange of queens. This is a very interesting pattern situation in many similar type of positions, and generally we define the positions based on the pawn structure, how the pawns are positioned. So in such situation, it's not so clear whether it's advantageous to actually trade those queens, despite the fact that white would now be having double pawns. However, at the same time, white would have opened up the A file for the rook without wasting any time, immediately find itself in an attacking position. For example, it means that the black rook will have difficulty in moving towards an open file without losing the A7 pawn. Of course, black may consider at some point to push the pawn up, let's say to A6, to a square where it's protected by another pawn. However, typically, white would want to try to push up his own b pawn to b5 when that would happen. Well, in any rate, this exchange on b3 certainly is a playable option for black, but it has been shown in practice that it's not always such an obvious decision to trade and get a better position. In fact, in this case, Karpov, who became world champion some years later, chose not to trade on b3 and in fact invite his opponent to trade on b6. And white also rejected the idea of trading on b6 for the same reason. If queen takes, pawn takes, then all of a sudden the black rook is the one aiming at white's pawn. Black would have a rather pleasant position after these moves, with the idea to appear with the knight on b4, capturing the pawn then on a2, as well as threatening with a potential fork on c2. So white would have to be very careful already at this point. Let's go back. And after knight e4, the actual game continued with the white bishop returning to f4. And black continued developing by playing knight to c6. Right now, black has just attacked the pawn on d4 a second time, so white better does something about it. So white now played e3, protecting the pawn on d4. And black continued developing with a tempo in this case by giving a check. And this was the critical moment of the game. Despite being at such an early stages in the battle, white already made a losing move. And a natural one at that. Try to think, what would you do if you're white? Would you move your king? Would you block the check? And if so, then with which piece and where? Well, moving the king is looks horrible. Not only giving up the right to castle, but the king would get in trouble immediately, since the f2 pawn would be hanging. White played the most natural move, and that is to develop the knight to d2. Moving the knight to c3 would lose a pawn right away, because black would first trade the bishop for the knight, and then remove the queens, exchange the queens, and simply grab the pawn on c3. So this would certainly not be a good idea for white, although we have to say still better than what happened in the game after white played knight b to d2. Now white cannot avoid losing a piece. I suggest you try to figure out what Karpov did in this position as black. What we see right now is that the white knight on d2 has positioned itself in a pin. And that in itself is a big danger. However, in this case, the other problem is that the only white knight that protects the knight on d2 on f3 can be chased away. And it seems like it cannot, but black has an intermediate move. First, attacking the bishop. And if the bishop moves away, then black is ready to advance the g-pawn to g4, attacking the knight. And if the knight moves, the other knight is lost. And if it doesn't move, then this knight is lost. Going back just a tiny bit here, if in this position white captures on g5, as he did in the game, then the best option for black is to make an unexpected fork. And that is to play queen a5, and not only attack white's knight on d2 a third time, but also all of a sudden attack the bishop on g5 also a second time. So ultimately, white at this point cannot avoid losing one or the other, either the bishop on g5 or the knight on d2. And therefore, white lost. Let's move back and see the next game, which is also a famous game by two of the greats of their time, Taras White against Bogolyubov. This game started out with white playing d4 just like the previous game and knight f6, and here white played a little bit differently by playing the ambitious c4 move. Black responded with e6 and white played knight f3. So now we are actually seeing the Queen's Indian defense. The idea of this opening for black is to try to control the center, not directly like in a Queen's Gambit where we immediately position our pawns in the center. Here black is trying to attack the center from the side with the bishop on b7. White again played the bishop g5 idea, developing and pinning the knight, and black played bishop b7. White continued with e3, trying to develop the light squared bishop. Black played h6, bishop h4, and black gave a check on b4. It looks like this is just like a normal move, no big deal. However, reality is that it is a rather tricky move. White now can easily go wrong, and in fact did in the game. The big question for white is how to block the check. Should it be the knight that hasn't moved yet? Should it be the other knight? Well, in reality, white can block with the knight from b1 to c3 or the knight b1 to d2. Surprisingly, the move that also looks rather natural to develop the knight to d2 is already a losing move. Pretty incredible. Now, similarly to the last example, black can very aggressively use this pin. Well, hopefully you got a hint from the first example of the lesson, and black is exactly using the same idea by playing g5, attacking the bishop, and then when the bishop moves, attacking the knight. But here, why is that a big problem? Since only the black bishop on b4 is pinning the knight. There is no other piece on it. Well, that's true. The problem is that will change after white's knight e5, black plays knight e4. And all of a sudden, the knight on d2 cannot be properly protected. Okay, let's go back and see how the game continued after black played g4. White responded with a counterattack by playing a3. But the problem is that after pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop, pawn takes pawn, all of a sudden, white finds himself in a fork. Both the bishop and the rooks are attacked. And therefore, white lost. And let's see one more example of opening traps. The next game is played by former world champion Mikhail Botvinnik against Sorokin. Botvinnik was white. The game started out with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and bishop b4. This is the so-called Nimzo-Indian defense, where it's typically a strategical game. White is trying to get full control of the center, but oftentimes what happens is black gets to exchange that bishop from b4 for the knight on c3 in order to create double pawns for white. Well, in the meantime, in this game, white prevented that idea by protecting the knight with the queen. Remember, in this situation, e4 would be a real bad idea, as the pawn could be lost. So going back to this position, white continued with queen c2 to be ready to capture on c3 with the queen in case black trades. But in this game, black played d5 instead. Note that the check on a4 does not achieve anything because a knight would block on c6 and protect the bishop on b4 simultaneously. So after d5, white traded the pawns on d5 and black captured back, and white continued with bishop to g5, again pinning that knight. Of course, there is no immediate threat. But black did not feel comfortable anyway and moved his queen out of the pin, perhaps with the idea to then liberate the knight and move it to e4. White allowed that, simply played e3, opening the diagonal of the light-squared bishop, when the knight moved to e4. Now the bishop on g5 is hanging, so it moved back. And here black played a tricky move, but not a good one. It was best to retreat the queen to e7, but black decided to play queen g6, which is certainly a tricky move if white is not careful, for example, just continues developing in a natural way. White would lose a piece immediately, because after the exchange on c3, the white queen now is hanging, so therefore white cannot recapture with the pawn. On the other hand, if white wants to make a trade, black could just move the knight away almost anywhere, well, not quite, but to e4, let's say, with a discovered check, and then safely capture the queen on g6. Okay, so let's go back just a tiny bit, because after queen g6, white, of course, does not fall for this trap, but rather moves the queen away to a protected square. And that's what happened, queen b3. Right now, white is attacking the bishop on b4, as well as eyes on the pawn on d5. Here, black's best option was to keep that pin and move the bishop to a5. Instead, black played c5, which is already a mistake. And now white played a seemingly non-dangerous move, but in reality it had a lot of spice to it. So now the knight is hanging, and black's best option was to retreat the knight to f6. Capturing on c3 is a blunder immediately, because now, after pawn captures back, the bishop is forced onto an unprotected square, and while black is not yet castling, this is a serious problem. Probably what black overlooked, that while after a queen check, black would be still ready to block the check and protect the bishop simultaneously. If white finds the correct move in this position, then black will be lost. And that unexpected move is to simply go and trade the bishop for a knight. So now there is no knight that will interpose and protect the bishop at the same time, and therefore now this fork results in a win of a piece for white. Well, I hope these ideas of traps will help you either to win games if your opponent is careless, or to avoid yourself falling into one of these little tricks. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this position, it is white's turn. And the trouble is that if white moves the knight, which is in a pin, then the bishop on f3 will be hanging. Nevertheless, white, playing correctly, can and will win the game. Before you listen further, I suggest you stop the recording and try to figure out the correct solution on your own. Then come back and see if you were correct. The correct move right now is the only correct move to play bishop to d5. Black has only one option now. That is to capture the knight. Check. Again, black is left with one option. King a5. And now, simply taking away all squares from the king. We see the threat, the white pawn moving up to b4. However, despite black having a good number of options what to move, none of them will help against the checkmate threat. Hope you enjoyed this lesson and be back next week for some more ideas of chess knowledge. Bye-bye.